good afternoon. Welcome to, I guess, the first day of the Smart Cities Expo. My name is Josh Kampel. I'm the CEO of Techonomy Media. I'll be moderating the next session. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to ask the panelists to come up here and join me. We'll do some quick intros. Because it's a nice, intimate group, I'm going to encourage anyone at any point, you have a question, we're not going to do Q&A at the end. Try to raise your hand. We don't have, unfortunately, extra mics, but I'll try to, sort of repeat the question. But let me first introduce the group we have here. To my left, I have Jeanethe Falvey, the Chief Digital Officer of the City of Boston, Pete Scantland, the CEO of Orange Barrel Media, Whitney, the Chief Content Officer of the City of Atlanta, and Katherine Oliver, Principal from Bloomberg Associates. Thank you for all joining us today. If you read the session description as published, the session really is to focus on cities, on storytelling, on owning your narrative, and giving a voice to the underserved, advancing equality and inclusiveness. So really, that's what we're going to try to talk about, some representatives from cities, Katherine coming from being inside a city to now consulting with cities, and Pete as a private company working with cities on their strategies. But being that we're here in Atlanta, I want to start with Keith. It's your backyard. When we spoke, really the first thing is about crafting that narrative and that story. Before we leverage all great technologies and all that, it's making sure we have a clear, concise message and story that the city's looking to tell. You mentioned, obviously, this One Atlanta as a key message that the mayor is looking to distribute. Talk a little about that and how you're thinking about developing that narrative and that story.
Sure. One Atlanta is the mayor's vision for what she hopes this city will become, accessing its potential, creating equity for every corner of all of our many diverse communities. There are basically 5 pillars to One Atlanta. I won't go through all of them, but basically they're all designed to lift everyone up. As I like to say, it's a policy designed to create a tide of success that lifts all boats in this city. I like to also say that, with the mayor's incentive to create this, her impetus was to leave no one behind in Atlanta. As you know, if you're from this city, this is a city of disparate extremes, very often characterized as 2 cities in one. And the fact of the matter is there's poverty issues, there's racial issues, that kind of thing. But with this principle in place, the goal is to bring these 2 vastly different components together and to work together. And so everything I do in terms of content tries to align itself with the One Atlanta principles.
So your role, Chief Content Officer, is a newly created role. I think you mentioned it's sort of fashioned after the Chief Storyteller role in Detroit. And your background's in broadcast journalism. So you've really come through the communication side of the city. Jeanethe, being that you're the Chief Digital Officer of Boston, it's interesting. We talked about that relationship between communications and technology, or CIO in a city. How is your role, thinking about now the story's crafted, you have the narrative, you have the messages, and you have all these channels, right? Social media, your website, how your television stations, as we've talked about. Talk a little about how your role now is sort of as taking in all that content and figuring out how to engage with the various constituents in the city.
Sure, and just to clarify a little bit, so the fact that I exist and my team exists, we work in partnership with our communications office, and they handle a lot of the press and media relations for the city. A lot of the storytelling can come from anywhere across the city, and so I see it as my team's role to be the facilitator of that and to be the curator. So oftentimes a lot of the storytelling that we get to do will be driven out of my team, which is also very nice because we get to elevate voices of the community through the community. So not only are we creating some of these stories and facilitating those that are just all around from the great work that's going on, but we're also thinking through what platforms to use and what technology to use to get those stories out. So we are managing all digital platforms for the city. So we'll be thinking through where and how can people see this. And we are very cognizant of the fact that not everybody is even online. So we're thinking through creatively, well, where can we have physical ad space across the city? Where do we leverage our digital assets? And where do we need to think outside the box?
And how are you seeing, so you come into the organization from the private sector, and you have all these departments, each with their own messages. You have the mayor sort of, with a broader message. How has it been sort of managing all those different messages, and how do you keep it concise and sort of, leverage all those channels? Has that been a challenge? Have you gotten buy-in across the city?
It's been an incredibly fun challenge, but I can't say it hasn't been a challenge. As I was starting with the city, there was one videographer that worked outside of our cable office. So we have our public access television team that covers city council hearings and whatnot. But started organically through the city and from the mayor's office, there was a interest to do more storytelling for the city. And so we've come a long way in the past couple of years, and now I have 2 videographers on my team that are in charge of digital storytelling, and we're gathering up fantastic ideas and at times creating space for our own, because we always have our own, but we see ourselves as aggregators, and working closely with the mayor's office and the communications office, they have their priorities that they want to hit pretty hard on. They certainly have a lot of events that they want coverage on, and so we just work it out in partnership. My messaging to them has been, listen, we can't be everywhere, and even if we publish every press event that the mayor's at, that's really not going to get your point across. The community is going to have some fatigue about, some podium fatigue, frankly. So what are some other ways in which we can get this story out? And we also love to connect dots. So yes, we're familiar and have great relationships across all departments, and we'll lift up what ideas they have and what they're trying to get across, and we'll tie it together with something else.
So Katherine, you sort of transitioned from working for Mayor Bloomberg in New York City to now being at Bloomberg Associates. For those not familiar potentially with Bloomberg Associates, give a little sort of background on what that...
And I started my career like Keith. I was a journalist, radio and television broadcaster, so always thinking about story, always thinking about audience and understanding who we're speaking to, and also recognizing the importance of having a marketing strategy. Because no matter how innovative or creative or engaging the content is that you're creating, if nobody knows about it, you don't have a marketing strategy, who cares? So Bloomberg Associates is part of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and it's a philanthropic international consultancy for cities. And we're advising global mayors, and I'm thrilled that we're working here in Atlanta with Mayor Bottoms, so hopefully our worlds are going to cross, our paths will cross. And my area, the work that we do, we have 8 disciplines. We have the principals on the team all served during the Bloomberg administration. Mike Bloomberg was mayor of the city of New York for 12 years, right after 9/11. And we have experience in different aspects of government. And my area and my colleagues, Todd Asher and Tess O'Brien, who are in the audience, work with me, and our focus is media, entertainment, and tech. So how are global mayors using media, entertainment, and technology as part of their economic development and their public communication strategies? So not every office or every city is going to be like a New York or an Atlanta, that there is a lot of film and television production. We worked in Kansas City. They didn't have a film commission. They wanted a film commission because they recognized that the creative community attracts jobs. That's where young people want to work, and people need to tell their stories. So you don't have to be an LA or a New York or an Atlanta with major sound stages. You can make a movie or a TV show on your phone now, and that could be applied to local businesses because people, fortunately or unfortunately, don't want to read text, they want to see video. So it was a great opportunity for economic development that we recognized, and now we're trying to transport that to other cities. But right after 9/11, it was very important to diversify the city's economy, explain that the city was safe, and to reassure locals, residents, and visitors that the city was safe to visit and work and thrive in. But it was important to diversify the city's economy, and that's why we looked at the film and the entertainment and the tech sector as areas of creative communities, and it was also a good way to market the city. And if you think, and we were talking about this earlier, if you think about New York City, we had Sex in the City, and then of course Girls, which came along much later on. That's advertising we couldn't buy. Every time this television show was on and showcasing the city, when you think about what Sex in the City did for Jimmy Choo shoes and Cosmopolitan, and people around the world would want to visit New York to experience the New York that they saw in the movies. And so it was in our best interest to really work with the creative community and market and promote the city.
And that plays into this idea of the need for public-private partnerships, right? To be able to work with the private sector to bring new jobs, development to the city.
But we didn't have any money. And,
Right.
you know, when I was talking about marketing, you know, okay, we're the city of New York. We had no money for marketing. So we created something called the Made in New York logo and a marketing initiative that really celebrated the creative community. And initially it was for film and television, and then we used it for the tech and the startup community. And it tapped into something years ago that we weren't aware of, and now we're seeing it in cities all over, local pride. And there is this sense of local pride when you go to cities around the world from the creative community, from different sectors, that it's homegrown. And that really created sense of community and also helped us leverage the public-private initiatives, because city government doesn't have resources, we don't have money, and we can't keep up with the changing technology. But by forging these alliances with the local business community and making it easy for the private sector to work with local government, you can leverage that and foster that relationship.
So we'll get back to if it's easy to work with city government, and Pete probably can comment on that, but it's a good transition. So Pete, your company, Orange Barrel Media, and is Ike a product and a service under Orange Barrel? Talk a little about what you're doing. I think we have a visual that we can bring up of what Ike is. They should be able to bring it up, but explain what it is and how you're working with cities to help them distribute content sort of at street level.
Sure. So Ike is, think of it like an 8-foot-tall iPhone that goes out on city sidewalks and helps residents and visitors to cities connect with whatever it is they need to do. It helps cities deliver services, such as how do you access transit information. It started largely around wayfinding. Many cities had the burden of maintaining these legacy analog wayfinding systems that were out of date and also limited in terms of what they could do. But today, what we're most focused on is how do we help deliver information and access to the most vulnerable populations. So for example, you can use Ike to discover how to find housing and how to access drug and alcohol rehabilitation, how to access jobs, things that, and you can do it using, and so I think someone mentioned this earlier, using our Wi-Fi connection, which for many in that population, unfortunately, they don't have. And so what we've done is built out infrastructure, are delivering it in a format that's pedestrian-oriented, relatively convenient to go lots of different places, and what the software does today is really a response to what cities have told us they want it to do. What it does today is better than what it did 3 months ago, but because it's software and we're shipping code every day, what it does 3 months from now will be better than what it does today, and that's really an interesting piece, and it's something we're spending a lot of time talking to cities about.
And your relationship with the city, right? So you're coming in, you're investing in the infrastructure and building this. It's a channel for the city to communicate with both residents and visitors. And then talk a little about the business model and how is this possible, because, you know, as we've heard, cities may have limited budgets to deploy new technology, the upkeep of that. Talk a little about the economic model and sort of how do cities really embrace these types of, you know, sort of technologies.
Yeah, that was really foundational from the very beginning in terms of how we developed the product, was knowing that cities aren't going to have a budget to invest in something like this. And so it's sponsorship and advertising supported. Also knowing that cities are going to care a lot about what's the relationship between that sponsorship and the services we're delivering. And so what we've done is developed a very clear, what I would call sort of an editorial versus advertising divide, in the same way that a television broadcast station would do it in their news, for example. So it's obvious to anyone who's using it what's a commercial message and what's not. So for example, in any of the applications, we don't allow any advertising, we don't allow any better placement, paying for placement, and we see that as really foundational to the service that we're delivering, which is for many of these culture organizations, many of these social services organizations, many of the independent retailers, restaurants, businesses that are getting discovered on Ike. You know, one of their big complaints has been, for many people, they're getting buried on Yelp, they're getting buried in Google, they're getting buried on many of the services that they're accessing on their cell phones because of a failure to maintain that objectivity when it comes to search results. And so we're, one of our value propositions to the cities and to the constituents within that city is that we're not going to sell better access. So when someone comes to Boston, for example, and says, what's the best deli? It's going to return what is in fact the best deli and not Panera just because Panera is paying us to do that.
So, you kind of talk about curation, right? So each of you have talked a little about, obviously, there's plenty of messages. You guys may sit as curators of what is the right message, how do I distribute it? In your case, the city is ultimately curating the content that you're seeing on Ike or an Orange Barrel. Talk a little about, we had a conversation in the green room about when you own a television network, when you have a website, how much, how proactive does the city need to be in controlling the narrative versus giving voice to really the community?
In the case of New York, I was responsible for the Mayor's Office of Film, Theater, and Broadcasting, the Film Commission, NYC Media, which was the city's public television channels. We had 5 cable channels, public access channels, and 1 FM radio station. And then in the third term, we created NYC Digital and appointed the first chief digital officer. So the relationships between these 3 entities allowed us to really reassess how we were connecting with the community. But the real gem was the 311 call center, because when we were thinking about figuring out what were we going to program and put on the city's communications channels, TV, radio, online, we needed to know our audience. And so we went to the call center and we said, give us the 100 questions you get every single day so we can find out what do New Yorkers what do visitors want to know. And do you know what the number 1 question is every single day and still is? Take a guess.
Well, on the website it was how to pay a parking ticket, right?
Close, alternate side of the street parking rules, so that's number 1 in New York every single day.
Right.
So we said, let's create content that answers some of these questions. So we came up with a strategy for TV content, radio content, and then creating animations that we could put online. Then we took it a step further and we created bus shelters and we leveraged a lot of the street furniture. We had an allocation there so we could promote city services. And if you've ever been to New York, in the back of cabs, there are television sets, and we sell that for advertising to generate revenue through the Taxi and Limousine Commission. But we created some content to educate New Yorkers and residents about city services. So that was another screen that we creatively just thought of to use as a resource.
Right.
Can I jump in on that as well? New York operates on such an enviable scale that most cities can't even approach or dream of approaching. And that is magnificent. But even on a level like Atlanta, which, is still a pretty big city, we are smaller in terms of how we deal and interact as a city entity with the residents. And one of the things we use is our NPU system. Our neighborhoods are very proactive and they let us know exactly what it is that they think are important issues of the day. And despite the fact that, say, a city like New York has this kind of massive scale, there's a great equalizer at work. I always call the internet the weapon of mass instruction because everybody can use the internet. Everybody is potentially their own TV station, their own radio station. And so we use the same platforms that they use. And we're not worried about getting out to 12 or 15 million people. We're worried about getting out to our 0.5 to 1 million people who have a vested interest in what's going on in the city. So the platforms equalize the abilities to get the messages out regardless of the size.
But there has to be a strategy, and somebody's got to be in charge to, there's an editor-in-chief, or somebody's got to make the decision what content are we putting out. So to Jeanethe's, it's working with the communications team. So if you've got a chief storyteller officer, they must be communicating with the communications team. And there are communications folks in each of the city agencies, so parks, fire, police. There's got to be coordination.
So we started there. We started with Keith as a chief storyteller coming in through communications. Jeanethe's office is sort of within the CIO's office. When you're thinking about from the mayor top down has to really set the directive. But how do you empower the teams? How do you create that culture where people are all on the same sort of page rather than, hey, here's the new person coming in just to blow things up. You know, again, when you think about your devices, who are you liaising with in the office? Talk a little about sort of how you've gotten that consensus, how you've built sort of across, you know, you gave a little story about taking control over Twitter handles, right? So departments historically that controlled their own Twitter handles, well, should that be centrally controlled? Talk a little about how you start to build sort of that efficiency inside the city government to understand how you're controlling that message.
Sure. Yeah, so a couple different ways. When I stepped into this role 2 years ago, we had PIOs, public information officers, seated within just about all departments. But there wasn't always a regular forum for them to get together. And we knew that their charge was, in addition to doing press and media materials for that department, also handling the social media that had been created, also doing 3 other things. So they really didn't have time to do social media and any outreach well. So I knew that our team, with growing capacity, could provide that partnership to them. So we really sought out to build trust and build relationships across various levels. So one, it was meet the PIOs at their level, have an aggregating meeting weekly to go over social media content, just to continually hit that trust marker and to remind them to share content with us, because we also weren't automatically getting it. We maintain the Central City of Boston accounts, and we do best practices work and support on the management platform that we use across the board, but we don't post to every 142 accounts that exist for the city. We've been working to bring that number down because the quality was bad, and we wanted to and inconsistent, and we wanted to make sure that we're getting the best quality information out for the public. So it was reminding PIOs that that was the purpose and the mission of social media, because they had often it had landed in their lap. This was something that leadership just expected. Well, I want to make sure we tweet 5 times a day so I can tell the mayor that we tweeted. And it's like, well, why? And why are you doing that if you also have a newsletter and you also have Facebook? Where is your audience you're even trying to reach, and whose mind are you trying to change? So it was working with them and giving them the relief that, oh, I can just give the content to you guys and you'll do it, and I don't have to worry about this. Yes, we got it covered. Then it was working with leadership and going around, and there's a great forum that we have that Intergovernmental Relations runs, where we just went on a road show and we talked about, again, what our team's purpose was, because we're still pretty new on the scene. The digital team has only been in existence for about 4 years. So it was reminding folks what we did and how we were working with their departments, and reminding them what we needed from them, but what we were here to do, and constantly going around and doing case studies. And then it was embedding ourselves with a couple departments and really showcasing the transformation that we were capable of, and having them do some of that speaking for us.
What we found in New York is that a lot of the city agencies were very siloed, and we're seeing this in other cities, and nobody talks to each other.
Right.
And even though people are in similar roles on the communications side, in the Parks Department or in the Health Department or Education or Police, nobody's communicating. They've never even met each other. And so
which is no different than big companies, right?
I was just going to say.
People lose sight that if anyone who works at a big organization, a big enterprise, that is similar there, right?
So one of the hallmarks of Bloomberg is to convene, bring people together, and to communicate. And so we do something, and we take this to different cities, but we did it in New York. We call it Engage, and we basically get the communications directors from all city agencies together for a professional development day. And this is opened up by the mayor of the city, and then we bring in Facebook, Twitter, Google, and we show how in crisis, whether it's a flood, a snowstorm, a blackout, how are these professional platforms like Facebook and Google and Twitter addressing some of these challenges that cities face? So the communications directors of all these different city agencies get to learn something, and they see, like real examples of things and tools that they can use. But it's also a great way for the city, if happens to be Atlanta, to share best practices. And suddenly, all of these communications directors are getting to know each other. They never met each other. So it's a really nice way to get everybody out of the office for half a day or a day. It's blessed by the mayor. You're bringing the public-private partnership piece in by getting Google and Facebook and Twitter to show up. And then we follow it up with subsequent professional trainings. But it's also a wonderful way to recognize the great efforts of what people are doing within government already that they have never had a shout out or a call. So it's a nice way to create sense of community.
So you're talking about coordination across, obviously, communications professionals, Pete, when we spoke, there's also coordination when you deploy something like what you're doing. There's power needed, there's connectivity, there's ordinances that may need to be changed so you could actually install these things on the street. Talk about the process, and for the people here who want to work with cities from the vendor side, some of the, how were you able to sort of get the right stakeholders in the room and get their buy-in to be able to deploy your types of solutions?
That's a good question,
So we have 9 minutes left, so you probably
and it's an ongoing. It's a life's work, honestly, to be able to develop a product that satisfies everyone at a city or at a company. I don't want to single out cities as tough to deal with, but cities, realistically, they have huge priorities that private businesses don't have. In cities, they're dealing with the issues of life and death, right, in many cases. They're dealing with issues of extreme poverty and homelessness and all these things. And so for us, it's, where we started was around discovery. And how do you tell the city story through discovering of the unique attributes of each city? But what we found is to get people excited in other areas of the city, it's about how do we help them do their jobs? How do we help them reach their constituents who they serve? And to follow up on the content question, I think that plays a role in it. And Ike is a broadcast platform, meaning it's a one-to-many device, but it's also a one-to-one. And so in the one-to-many format, we can show a message that would have broad utility. For example, we can show road closures that we can pull from that would be one aspect of a city that would like to communicate that information. We just launched a couple weeks ago. We're pulling out of thin air now through an integration with FEMA, storm, and other emergency warnings and deploying those in real time with instructions that are done that come embedded in the message. And so and I think this is their first public sort of way to display this visually. So they're really excited about that, as are we. But there's something in tons of different areas of the city. And so we focused on how do we make sure that we're delivering broad value to not only the folks of the city, but also the public who they're ultimately trying to serve.
So I want to go back to this sort of idea of this inclusiveness and sort of making sure we're delivering accessible content to the whole population of the cities, because each of you gave a couple examples when we spoke about the language we use, right? At what level it needs to be. Everything from accessibility on a website, from contrast and doing testing and that type of thing. If each of you want to talk a little about how you're making sure that cities are developing content that is accessible, that meets the needs of the broader population, not just finding the best sushi restaurant, right? We talked about that. It's a high usage. But for the people who need real access to information that they can't get elsewhere, talk a little about how you're thinking about making sure that it's really serving the city's purpose, not just sort of always looking pretty, but really being accessible to the broader population.
So my team's presence is a constant reminder, and we talk about this every day. We are the filter that allows an equal opportunity for all information to reach all of our platforms, but an equal opportunity to ensure that it's consistently high quality. We publish everything on Boston.gov with the exception of press releases and public notices. Everything is at or below an 8th grade reading level, and we hold ourselves to this standard. We want to make sure that everybody has the best shot at reading it, and it makes it easier to translate, easier for interpretation. We adhere strictly to our brand guidelines, which we're working with and expanding every day, but that's guiding the color usage. And as you were alluding to, we'll hear from constituents if we're not meeting their needs. One person writing in saying, I couldn't actually read this web page, it wasn't meeting the contrast requirements that I have, will put us to work for weeks to make sure we fix it. And that's our driving focus. It doesn't matter whether one person is struggling or thousands. We have to work for everybody within reason. But web accessibility is a whole other topic, but we work very hard to work to high standards.
And as far as with Ike at street level, everything, you're figuring out how you could serve the broader population. Actually, you talked a little about access to social services, but how are you thinking about the content, that interactivity with the device?
Yeah, so it's open and usable by everyone. So it's available in any language. and in certain areas, English wouldn't necessarily be the default language that it would be placed in. And so that's been a real foundational principle for us from the beginning, is how to ensure that it is useful to everyone, and we spend a lot of time working on that through the software and the physical design as well.
You know, nobody cares about a story that they don't know exists. And so, in my opinion, it's our job to just go scan what's happening all across the city, use our own acumen. I mean, mine is driven over 40 years of storytelling. And so I would hope that I'm somewhat, radared in on what people are thinking. And so you just put the stories out there. You make them as authentic as you can. Writing is a skill set that, a good writer chooses his words the way a boxer chooses his punches. And you deliver it for the most, efficacy. And I think that as long as you keep your voice authentic, you don't talk down to, your audience. I mean, they're our residents. I'm a resident. I'm a people who lives here in Atlanta, just like they are people who live here in Atlanta. And so as long as you keep that connection, that authenticity.
And you mentioned actually telling the stories through their own voices, right? Not only just reporting on them, but actually allowing them to...
Absolutely. I'm not a big fan of, the recitation of the facts like you find in a lot of media. I'm a fan of personalizing policy. There's an office for that. If you just want a recitation of what this policy does, we got people for that. But if you want to understand what it means and how it affects you and see yourself in that story, or someone who looks like you and you can resonate with them, that's what we do.
I think it comes down to a few key areas. I think it's mission, strategy, and creativity or innovation. The mission is set by the mayor. The mayor has got to, what's the plan? What are the challenges? And there might be seasonal messaging, recycling or removal of snow or heat waves or freezing cold or, flu outbreak, whatever it is. There has to be a strategy. You've got to have coordinated messaging. So it comes down to the communications directors. Is it a daily meeting? Is it an email message? Is it a calendar? So if the Parks Department is making an announcement about something, how is that impacting PD? So if you're telling a story, if the mayor is telling the story, you've got to be able to reflect that agency by agency. And there's got to be some creativity. Have fun with it. We're competing with a lot out there. People, everyone gets information and has curated information from multiple sources every day. So how is the city of Atlanta going to be competing with the top 5 stories from CNN that I'm getting in my inbox every day? What do I need to be looking at here? So you've got to be able to draw the attention of the people in the city that you serve.
Right.
Nobody expects fun from government.
So, again, we talked a little about, mayors. The mayor of Atlanta, she's really, you mentioned why you transitioned from broadcast journalism to working for the city. How involved is she in sort of, this ongoing development of the narrative and the stories that you're putting out there?
Well, the mayor, I don't know if a lot of people know this, the mayor is a former journalist herself, and so there's that simpatico that is immediately established. And, I'm one of those hardcore reporters. I'm not a feature guy. I'm the guy that, if something died or something burned or something was robbed, I'm the guy they sent. And, I don't like anybody. And so I bring that to my job. But when I spoke with her, she sounded like maybe the most progressive mayor this city has had since Maynard Jackson. And so she's really involved, and it was convincing to me, and I'm not easy to convince. And so hopefully I think the city sees that kind of authenticity in her, right. And I hope we kind of convey the message as well. But she's very tuned in to every story. Every story has to be aligned with One Atlanta.
And in Boston, mayor's involved?
Yeah, he is out of City Hall more than he's in it. He's constantly in the community. And so again, it's our job to help him tell the story of the work that he's having done in his administration, but also to raise the voice of the community. And a lot of what we're doing is giving voice to community members in light of programs that they're receiving and involving with at the city. So again, it's less from here's a city directly telling a story. It's like, no, we're giving the voice and the opportunity for this individual who's a returning citizen to share their story, because that's going to be a lot more impactful for others that are facing that situation to listen to and to see that model and to be inspired by. And then, the city is just in the background.
Right.
So.
And in our last 30 seconds, Pete, I'll give you sort of, as a company looking to work with cities, what are those sort of pearls of wisdom of sort of, once you start to get into the nitty gritty, how best practice on how to work with the city?
I think the thing that I always, on my better days I remember is that, my sense of urgency to do business with the city might not be matched because the city has other priorities that they're working on, to what I said earlier. And so having sympathy and understanding around the fact that the people that we're trying to deal with, in many cases, although the work that we're going to do together will be important, I believe, it might not rise to the level of urgency that I would like it to. And so just remembering that it takes a long time to make real progress, and just sticking with it and having patience that ultimately, if you can deliver a great service and that it delivers on a genuine need that a city has and a city's citizens might have, ultimately that should be rewarded.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.